Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians here at the start of the new month. The Russians have managed to advance continuously in the Kamyanske direction, expanding the zone of control within the town in the western parts of the Zaporizhia region. The Russians also continued advances west of the Serbis River line in the northern flank of Liman, while the Ukrainians have been launching some counterattacks over the past few weeks, which has allowed them to regain some parts of territories that I'm leaving in the gray zone for now, as the footage is unclear whether the Ukrainians control them or not. Some of these have been reported to be gray zones for a while now, therefore it is likely that there's a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in those areas. The Russians have also started an offensive operation in the Kharkiv region. Whether this is just a probing attack or a genuine offensive, time will tell, but this marks a potential large-scale offensive by the Russians this summer in the Kharkiv region. Starting out in the north, what we see is that the Russian Ministry of Defense reported that the Russians have captured the town of Milove. I'm not sure exactly what they captured, if it's the entire town, because it's very wide. It could be that they captured parts of it and then reported the capture of the town. In either case, this is the first time in a very, very long time, approximately 3 years, since they have last been present in this area, following the Ukrainian counterattack at the end of 2022. The Russians here marked their first attempt at crossing the border in the Izium direction since the initial invasion in 2022. If the Russians have gained full control over Milove, likely with a push from Butyrki in the north and Novopetrovka from the east, the Russians will have marked their first bridgehead in this section for a long time and will open up for a Russian offensive across the border area along the main highway in a western direction, where we have seen the Russian continuously launch offensive operations across the Oskar River line in the Doverishna direction, which also has a highway that leads up here the same direction as this new border crossing. And with the first Russian offensive operations in the southern parts of Vovchansk in over a year, the Russians can launch a three-pronged offensive operation to meet here in the center between the three directions for a large-scale offensive, moving down south along the western bank of the Uskar River line all the way down south towards Izium to regain control over the area that they lost during the Ukrainian Kharkiv counteroffensive in 2022. Such an offensive would have devastating consequences for the Ukrainians in the eastern section of the front line. The Russians would look, with a border crossing here in the north, to gain control over the areas they lost during the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive, to which they'll look to advance all the way down south towards Izium and regain control over Izium. This would mean that the Russians would cut off the northernmost road leading into the Donetsk region. If they continue to push all the way down south towards Bervinkove, they'll be able to cut off the railway connection as well. This will cut off the northern supply route into the Donetsk region, with the Pokrovsk supply route being cut off by the current Russian offensive operations in the western parts of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians would no longer have the necessary amount of supply routes to properly supply the forces operating within the Donetsk region. It will significantly speed up the Russian capture of the region, or what remains of it. The Russians, with a combined push towards the northern flank of Liman and a push to capture Siversk as well, would allow, with such a push towards Izium, to operationally encircle the Slovyansk-Konstantinivka line in its entirety. It will also redirect Ukrainian forces from the defense of Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, which the Russians are heavily pressuring as we speak. This means that the Russians would significantly upscale their offensive operations during this summer period, and this could mark a Russian attempt to gain full control over the Donetsk region by the end of summer. As for the remaining developments, we see that the Ukrainians have launched some counterattacks in the direction of Zahrizove, where they were geolocated to be present at the northern parts of the town. Zahrizove has been reported to be in a gray zone over the past 4 months. I've not really changed the front line situation in the area due to a lack of information. But now that we see geolocated footage of the Ukrainians in the northern parts, as they were driving towards the north, they were struck by Russian fire. Therefore, it is unclear whether they were able to consolidate their possessions in the area. So we have to wait up until follow-up information arrives to clear whether they are present and have control over the town or whether it remains in the gray zone. To the south, across the Serebets River line, the Russians are storming Zelena Dolina head-on following the week-long operational encirclement of the town. The Russians are now gaining control over the eastern parts of the town and moving on to the western parts, where they look to gain full control of it and then pressure the Ukrainians onwards towards Shendri-Holove. The Russians also managed to gain control of the remaining parts of the eastern bank and parts of Karapivka here to the west. Gaining control over both Zelena Dolina and the eastern parts of Karapivka would open the road for a push towards Zretne and Shendri-Holove. The push towards these settlements would cut off one of the two main supply lines from the western direction towards Liman, the one that goes through Shendri-Holove, and the second one to the south of the forest lines here connecting to the north of Sloviansk. The Ukrainians have three roads leading into Liman. There's the western roads, then there's the Sloviansk road directly across the Seversko-Donetsk River, and then there's the Siversk road again directly across the Seversko-Donetsk River. The Russians will likely bombard all of these river crossings while they attempt to gain control over Liman, and with physical control over the roads to the west of Liman, the Russians would be able to operationally encircle the city during a siege of it. The Russians will be looking to gain full control over the eastern and western banks of the Usk River lines during such an offensive from the Kharkiv region towards Izium, which will then allow them to launch offensive operations in the direction of Barankovo and the rear of the Ukrainian positions within the region. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians also were geolocated here in the southern parts of Myrolyubivka. With the recent Russian advances to the north in the direction of Mykolaiivka, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians would be able to hold onto their positions within Myrolyubivka. And again, the vehicle that was driving to drop off Ukrainian infantry was struck in the southern parts of the town. It is unclear where it came from the eastern or from the northern directions. In either case, the Russians will likely launch continuous offensive operations to gain control over Mykolaiivka. This will operationally and physically encircle Myrolyubivka. If there are any Ukrainian forces remaining within it, the Russians will likely recapture it soon. And again, it is not confirmed whether the Ukrainians were able to establish themselves within the town or not. Therefore, we await further confirmation. In the southern section of the front line in the direction of the Zaporizhia region, the Russians continued offensive operations in the northern parts of Kamyanske, but they continued advances alongside the river line itself, gaining control over additional fortified positions in the eastern parts of the northern parts of the town. Russians are here fighting over the Ukrainian defensive line that stretches from the very eastern outskirts of Kamyanske to the central parts of the town. At the same time, they're bypassing their residential area and moving into the Dashna area in the direction of Plavny and further north along the positions. This is to cut off the supply road that leads directly into the northern parts of the town and gain control over the fortified positions in the eastern and northern parts of it, which will allow the Russians to secure the positions within the town and a buffer zone beyond it. Russians will here look to gain control over the town to secure parts of the highway that leads up to Zaporizhia and to spread out the Ukrainian forces along the front line for future offensive operations, where they will expand the zone of control and the front line itself by launching additional offensive operations along the border area and pressure the Ukrainian forces in already established frontline positions. With regards to the recent developments, the Washington Post released this opinion article by the editorial board of the Washington Post. This article talks about the recent developments across the front line, the new Russian offensive here during the summer, and the US cutoff of very important supplies to Ukraine in terms of ammunition to Ukrainian air defense, artillery, and much more. This cutoff of supplies that is instantaneous, sudden, and during a Russian offensive can have significant effects on the front line. They talk about how this phrase was made to put America's interest first, as according to the White House Press Secretary's Office, due to the supplies running low within the United States due to the war in Ukraine over the past 3 years, as well as the Israeli conflict with Iran that has spent up a lot of air defense for Israel, not to mention the Israeli war on Gaza, Lebanon, bombardment of Syria, and much more. All of these add up, especially when they use US ammunition to launch these operations. Now, Ukraine is seeing a significant lack of ammunition, defensive weapons, troop shortage, and much more due to its own high military casualty rate. They talk about these regular propaganda points that both sides have taken a lot of losses, but the Russians have, of course, taken more losses, and they are, of course, having a very difficult situation. But through all of this propaganda, as they said, towards the end, in other words, in a war of attrition, Russia has the advantage. What Ukraine did have was the firm backing of the United States. Now, with Trump's freeze of weapons, that is in question. And they talk about the possible loss of Ukraine in this war. They talk, if Russia prevails in its war of aggression, it will not be because of a lack of Ukrainian resolve, it will be because of American fecklessness. But in reality, it's because the US do not have the supplies to continue supplying Ukraine. The Patriot PAC-3 missiles, there's not a lot in stock, and they have sent a lot to Ukraine. They have sent a lot to Israel and its own bases because of Iran, mainly through launching these massive missile strikes, but also recently because Russia has launched its own massive missile strikes on Ukraine, massive drone strikes with up to 500 drones. All of these take down the ammunition that the Ukrainians have received from the US, and the US simply cannot create air defense missiles at the rates the Russians are creating drones and missiles. In conclusion, what this article says is that Ukraine is in a very difficult position. They lack equipment and manpower, and they really do not have the necessary forces to hold back a large-scale Russian offensive. So if the Russians really do have the manpower and equipment to launch a large-scale offensive, and they launch such a large-scale offensive, the Ukrainians may lose the war. And that is exactly why the Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov, said in late 2024 that during the year of 2025, they expect that the Russians will meet the territorial goals of the war, which is full control over Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. We still see a significant portion lacking from Russian control that remains under Ukrainian control. Yet there's been no backtracking of that statement, which indicates either the Russians are overly optimistic or they have a plan that is yet to be set in motion for the Russians to capture these 3 regions within the next 6 months. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.